Morning and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2020. We have received apologies this morning from Donald Cameron and Alex Cole-Hamilton. I would ask all members and witnesses please to ensure that mobile phones are silent and all other notifications are turned off during the meeting. The first item on our agenda this morning is related to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. We have two EU extra-related instruments for policy consideration under later agenda items this morning. First, we must consider if these instruments have been laid under the appropriate procedure and categorisation. Where an instrument corrects certain deficiencies in retained EU law, the lead committee has had the opportunity, in advance of policy consideration, to recommend to the Scottish Government whether the parliamentary procedure allocated to the instrument should be changed. This is known as the SIFT, and the first instrument we consider today in relation to the SIFT is the Cross-Border Healthcare EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 in draft. This instrument has been laid under the affirmative procedure and categorised by the Scottish Government as being of medium importance. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument on the 24th of November. It agreed that it was content that the instrument had been laid as an affirmative and also content that it should be categorised as medium in terms of its significance under the SSI protocol. Can I ask if any members have any comments to make in relation to the procedure and categorisation of this instrument? If not, thank you very much. The second instrument to be considered in relation to the SIFT is the Food and Feed EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020. This has been laid under the negative procedure and categorised by the Scottish Government as being of low significance. The DPLR again considered this instrument on the 24th of November and again agreed that the use of the negative procedure was appropriate because of its technical nature and also that it should be categorised as of low significance for the same reasons. Are we all agreed that this instrument has been laid under the correct procedure and categorisation? We are so agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes the committee's consideration of the SIFT of these instruments. We then move on promptly to the second item of our agenda, which is to consider the affirmative of these two instruments. That is the Cross-Border Healthcare EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020. As an affirmative, we have an evidence session with the Minister for Public Health and Sport and Wellbeing on the instrument, the opportunity to ask questions and then to debate formally the motion that the Minister will move. These regulations make provisions relating to certain patients participating in European cross-border healthcare who are in a transitional situation on the EU exit implementation period completion day and will ensure that the Scottish statute book will function correctly after this date. It is a standalone piece of cross-border legislation, not linked to any other arrangements. And I welcome to the committee to consider this matter Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, who is accompanied on this occasion by John Brunton, Senior Policy Manager, Safety, Openness and Learning Unit in Healthcare Quality and Improvement Division, Directorate rather, of the Scottish Government, and Arizo Darvishadze, Solicitor with the Legal Directorate, also from the Scottish Government. Can I thank you all for joining us today, and can I invite Joe Fitzpatrick to make a brief opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to join you this morning to discuss these regulations. It remains the Scottish Government's clear position that the interests of Scotland would best be served by remaining in the European Union. Devastation to worldwide economies caused by COVID-19 has only served to strengthen that view. However, as a responsible government, we're duty-bound to make necessary preparations to ensure that the Scottish statute book remains operable at the end of the transition period on the 31st of December this year. At present, under the European Cross-Border Healthcare Directive, European Economic Area citizens have the right to obtain healthcare services in other EEA countries. However, the treatment must be the same as or equivalent to treatment that is provided by their home state. The patient pays for the treatment up front and may claim reimbursement limited to the amount that the same or equivalent treatment would cost had it been provided by the state at home, which for our purposes would be in Scotland on the NHS. As health has evolved, the National Health Service Cross-Border Healthcare Scotland Regulations 2013 implemented the directive in Scotland where necessary. Importantly, the 2013 regulations set out the need for prior authorisation to travel for expensive specialist treatment. Cross-border health EU exit, Scotland Amendments, etc. Regulations 2019 provided a mechanism to ensure that there was no interruption to cross-border healthcare arrangements for people accessing healthcare through the directive after EU exit date in the event of a no deal. This would have applied to those member states that agreed to maintain existing reciprocal arrangements with the UK for a transition period until the 31st of December 2020. Cross-border healthcare requires basic reciprocal arrangements in order to operate. 2019 regulations were originally due to take effect on 29th of March 2019. However, as a result of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020, this was suspended as the UK continued to be subject to EU law until the implementation period completion date, that's 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020. The 2020 regulations reflect this position. European reciprocal healthcare arrangements are separate from cross-border healthcare. Existing reciprocal healthcare arrangements remain extant until the end of the implementation period, when reciprocal arrangements set out in the withdrawal agreement for existing participants in the EEA and UK will come into force. Negotiations between the UK and EU on wider reciprocal healthcare arrangements after the implementation period are ongoing. European cross-border healthcare has not featured in the negotiations between the EU and UK. Therefore, when the implementation period comes to an end, it will no longer be possible for UK citizens, including Scots, to exercise previous EU rights in this regard. The instrument therefore terminates the existing cross-border healthcare arrangements in place between the UK and the EU. This instrument, however, protects patients who find themselves in a transitional situation on implementation period completion day, including individuals who obtained prior authorisation for planned treatment before completion day but have not yet obtained the treatment, individuals who accessed healthcare abroad prior to completion date but have not yet completed the treatment or sought reimbursement, and also, and importantly, UK state pensioners from Scotland living in other EEA countries who need to access healthcare provided by the NHS while in Scotland. These time-limited measures aim to prevent a sudden loss of cross-border healthcare rights for Scottish residents and pensioners from Scotland residing in the EEA. Consider the amendments to be technical for the most part, and I hope that members agree that as part of the Scottish Government's overall programme of legislation planning for EU exit, the Cross-Border Healthcare EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 provide necessary changes to protect Scottish residents' rights to access cross-border healthcare as part of that can be achieved, as far as that can be achieved for the. We're of course happy to take questions on the draft regulations.
Thank you very much. And can I ask any members who have questions to indicate with an R in the request box? Can I start, Minister, by asking you first of all, in terms of the narrow impact of this amendment in relation to people undergoing treatment on the 31st of December, how many people do you estimate, or does the government estimate, may be affected by this amendment?
Very low, convener, and possibly none. There is a very relatively low number of people who go through this process, but I think it's very low. John, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you're right, Minister. There's very few sort of people going through the system at the moment, and with COVID, the numbers will be even smaller.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Emma Harper.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks. That was pretty much my question, was about the number of people who would be affected. And I'm actually quite surprised to hear that it wasn't part of any negotiations as we're exiting, but is that related to the fact that it's a very small number?
Minister, and could you also confirm that what you said indicates that there will be no cover in place after this transitional arrangement is completed, as far as it's possible to say at this stage?
So in terms of the specifics about what this is about, in terms of that type of going to seek treatment in EEA, that will end on the 31st. So I think that's appropriate. This is about saying that, no one should fall through the cracks, because after that date, people would obviously have to make other arrangements in terms of healthcare. But it's to make sure that the law works in practice for everyone. There's nobody falls through the cracks. While it's very unlikely there will be many, if any, people in that category, it's important that we have mechanisms in place to protect them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think there are no further questions from colleagues, so we will now move to agenda item 3, which is the formal debate in the made affirmative SSI, on which we have just taken evidence, the cross-border healthcare EU Exit Scotland Amendment regulations. I remind members that this is now a formal debate. I will invite the Minister in a moment to move the motion, and any other members who wish to contribute to the debate should indicate with an R in the request to speak box. Minister, can I invite you to move the motion?
Formally moved.
And this is motion S5M 23423. Formally moved. Can I invite any members who wish to contribute to the motion, to the debate? Sorry. I see no members who wish to add anything. Minister, is there anything to add from your point of view?
No, I think we've covered it. It's pretty technical in what it's actually doing. So.
Thank you very much. The question then is that motion S5M 23423 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. That concludes consideration of this instrument, and we will report to Parliament accordingly. Thank the Minister and his officials for their attendance this morning. The fourth item on our agenda is an evidence session as part of our short inquiry into the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on sports clubs and sports and leisure venues. Our inquiry has a particular focus on any reductions or cessation of community-based activities undertaken by sporting organisations, including mental and physical health impact. However, this morning's session is specifically concerned with the correspondence between the committee and the government in relation to the impact on Scottish professional football clubs and the linkage they have to community hubs and the delivery of other types of community sport. We will have a further evidence session on other aspects of this inquiry in the new year. Members will know that we received a response from Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, and I welcome back to the committee the Minister, Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, this time accompanied by Andrew Sinclair, Head of Active Scotland, and Stuart Harris, Chief Executive of Sports Scotland. Welcome, and again, Minister, I think you want to say a few words to begin the discussion. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I'm really pleased that the committee is taking forward this inquiry, because I think it is really important. We absolutely recognise that this has been an enormously challenging time for the sporting sector as well as the country as a whole, and we appreciate their support over the past months to help us tackle the virus. Our approach throughout the pandemic has been to permit as much sport and physical activity as possible. We've taken this decision given the broad physical and mental health benefits it brings at a time when these are especially needed. This has included the prioritisation of under-18 sport and physical activity, with exemptions in place for activity both outdoors and indoors in relation to the travel restrictions. In addition, under the strategic framework, we've provided travel exemptions for those living in level 3 and 4 areas to enable access to local green space for sport and physical activity. From the beginning of the pandemic, we've prioritised communications to encourage people to stay active within the restrictions. Our Clear Your Head mental health campaign to help people cope during the pandemic has encouraged people to keep moving or get outside, recognising the benefits of those activities on mental health. Physical activity resources attached to that campaign have been widely utilised by the public. We've worked closely in partnership with Sport Scotland to support the sporting sector during this time, and has ensured that the development of overarching national guidance to support the development of sport-specific guidance by Scottish governing bodies of sport. That's permitted a large number of sports to continue to operate in communities across Scotland in a COVID-safe way. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, many sport clubs and community organisations have supported their communities by, for instance, supplying food provisions to those most in need, demonstrating how sport can go above and beyond to aid Scotland's recovery during this unprecedented time. Active schools in Inverclyde, Stenhousemuir Football Club and Dundee West Football Club are three of many examples. Principles of equality and inclusion run through our Active Scotland Outcomes framework and Sport Scotland's corporate strategy, Sport for Life. We recognise that COVID has exacerbated existing inequalities, and our focus in this area will be key to our recovery from COVID. Scottish Government's programme for government reflects its approach with an increased focus on improving population health and tackling health inequalities, particularly in the context of the pivotal role that sport and physical activity will play in our recovery from this pandemic. We'll continue to work in partnership with Sport Scotland and the wider sporting sector on this critical future work programme. Again, I want to thank the committee for their interest in what is a vital area, and I look forward to collaborating with the committee on how we can take this forward in the future.
Thank you very much, Minister. You announced at the end of last week, the government announced additional funding for sports clubs affected by the COVID crisis, and in particular a total of 55 million made up of loans and grants. Can I start by asking you about the loan element of that, and in particular in relation to Premiership football clubs, of which there are 12 and for which the funding on offer appears to be entirely loan funding of £20 million. Can you indicate a bit more about how the package will operate in general and in particular in relation to these Premiership clubs, Minister?
So yes, you're right. The 55 million is made up of a mixture of grants and loans, and for the Premiership teams, we've provided £20 million of loan fund. The basic principles of the loan fund is that it needs to be within state aid rules, so roughly base rate. We're in discussions with the SFA exactly about how that will be distributed. We'd expect on the face of it that would be equally divided across the 12 clubs. That's of course assuming that all 12 clubs would want to access the loan fund. So clearly, if say one or two of the clubs felt that they didn't require that particular level of support, then it might be that other clubs are able to access more. So we've allocated £20 million for the Premiership, and it's a significant amount of money, and it's the amount of money that I'm really hopeful makes sure that all of those clubs can sustain through what I know is a challenging time into the future.
I know from my own hometown club of Aberdeen Football Club that 20 million may as a headline sound like a significant sum, but once it's addressed to the financial losses that are being faced by Premiership clubs through the loss of spectator gate money, through the loss of hospitality money and sponsorship, it may not go terribly far. Can you identify how far you've consulted with individual clubs in reaching that sum total of 20 million as a loan fund? Minister.
So in terms of identifying the funding we were providing across sport, the 55 million, we Active Scotland and Sport Scotland did a piece of work to try and identify all the challenges. Clearly, the biggest challenge for me as Minister was that when we finally got clarity of what the Barnet consequential was from the UK fund, it would amount to something like £4.5 million of revenue, and clearly, had we spread that out across Scottish sport, then I think you're right, it would not have made the impact that was necessary to ensure the sustainability of sports, which is why I'm really pleased that we have managed to significantly increase that package. I think the revenue support across sport is something like 8 times higher than the Barnet consequential, and the loan element I think is also significantly higher. But because of the way we've managed to profile the grants and loans, I'm really pleased that £20 million for the 12 clubs, that's 1.66, something like that, just over £1.6 million available for each club should they require it. I think there's perhaps a couple of clubs that won't require that, which might mean that there's a little bit more for others. But those discussions are ongoing. Andy, do you want to say a little bit more about the discussions with SFA around the distribution?
Andrew Sinclair.
Hi there. Yeah, Minister, I think you've covered it pretty comprehensively. I think our intention was always to focus on the lower leagues where we believed the need was greater, with allowing the Premiership clubs the ability to access those loans if and when they needed it. And again, as the Minister said, we carried out a consultation process with the Scottish FA to gather all the financial data in advance, so we really understood the financial position across all tiers of football before making any decisions.
Just so to understand, in relation to the Premiership clubs, have you discussed these financial positions directly with each of these clubs, or have you had discussions only with the Scottish Football Association, which clearly has a very wide remit covering football at all levels? Andrew Sinclair.
So we principally dealt with the Scottish FA and the SPFL to gather that data. We have had some individual discussions with clubs, but we tend to go through the governing body in order to collect that information.
And Minister, can you tell us then, is the intention that the loans will be provided directly to clubs, or will they be provided through a third party or Premiership clubs, Minister?
Yeah, so thanks. So we're working with the SFA to finalise that kind of detail. Clearly, the loans have to meet the state aid rules. So you're looking at Bank of England rate, I think, and so that detail is being discussed with SFA just now. I think they'll be meeting with the SPFL clubs, the top league clubs, this week, I think.
Thank you very much. And can I call David Stewart?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and officials. And could I refer members to my registrar of interests as Chair of Inverness Cally Thistle Trust and a season ticket holder since the club was formed in 1994. Minister, the Convener's already covered some of the points I was wanting to flag up, which is that football clubs are facing a perfect storm. I met Neil Doncaster, Richard Leonard just a week, confirmed that problem. Few or no fans, matchday revenues fallen off a cliff, and COVID-19 compliance costs sky high. My view is, regrettably, I believe clubs will go to the wall early next year. So I do support the package that you've come up with. In my view, after talking to clubs, it needs to be quick, it needs to be understandable, and it needs to be non-bureaucratic. So how do the clubs apply? How quick can the Scottish Government decide? You mentioned that there's £10 million available out with the Scottish Premiership. Are you allocating that to specific divisions, for example, Championship, First Division, Second Division? And what is the split of that £10 million between grant and loan?
Minister.
So thanks to Mr. Stewart, and I recognise his particular interest, which is, I think, helpful having someone on the committee. I know we have others on the committee with other particular interests in other football teams as well, and it's useful for us to be able to tap into that. I think he's absolutely right. If we did nothing, then particularly at the lower levels, where the income streams are really, really challenging, they don't have access to some of the funding which is available and still streaming through in the Premiership. So that's why we've taken the decision to focus the grant side of this onto the Championship and below, because I think it will really be the difference between some of these clubs which are so important to their communities surviving and going under. And my job as Minister for Sport is to do what I can to support, to make sure that no clubs go under. If that would be my aim, is that no club should go under. And clearly, it's not just football; there's other sports impacted as well. Yeah. We can't underestimate the particular importance in relation to football to our society. I think in principle, we'd be looking at the 10 million being divided right down all of the lower leagues, starting at the Championship, with equal divisions within each league. Now, clearly, the need for support from the different leagues from the Championship down is not the same, because the loss is less, and that's part of the calculation we've been looking at, is what what funding have the clubs, are they missing in terms of spectators, and what funding streams are they still managing to acquire. So again, that's part of the detail that we're finalising with the SFA, but I think you're absolutely right. We need to do this as quickly as possible. As I understand, elsewhere perhaps money hasn't flowed as quickly as clubs would have liked after announcements. I hope that the huge amount of effort that Active Scotland and Sport Scotland have done to understand the financial challenges mean that we can get the money flowing to the clubs as quickly as possible, like Mr. Stewart says, is so important.
David Stewart.
Yeah, I welcome the Minister's comments there. I think the Minister does understand the real cash flow problem that clubs are facing. And the Minister will know this, but just for those perhaps watching, I spoke to some senior members of key banks this week, and they were telling me, look, the vast majority of football clubs do not have an overdraft situation. They don't have financial support from banks. And even the UK government, CBILS system, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan, which is excellent. The problem is, as far as I can detect, no club in Scotland has got this because none of the clubs meet the viability test, which is crucially important. The only institution that's got it is the SFA, and they've managed to put Hampden up as collateral. So there's a real problem here, Minister. So I think I'd emphasise the money quickly, non-bureaucratic, early decisions will be absolutely vitally important. And my final question at this stage, Convener, is I think you've touched on the issue about the pyramid in Scotland. Obviously, I've got a particular interest as a Highlander in the Highland League. Obviously, I'm aware of the South of Scotland League and, of course, the crucial role that women's football plays as well. How much will be looked at there? Is the 10 million, I think you've touched on this, all going to be grant, or is there a mixture of grant and loan within that 10 million package, which is out with the Premiership?
Minister.
Yeah, so thanks, and I guess just to say that prior to the question, I recognise all the points that Mr. Stewart said are very robust points and well made. In terms of out with the Premiership, all of the funding is grants. And I think that's really important. And it's really important that funding does support football at all levels. So in terms of the women's game, in terms of the amateur game, and in terms of the Highland League, I'm really pleased that for most Highland League teams, they're now able to have some fans back, and clearly so that will help them. But nonetheless, all levels of the game have been impacted by COVID, and so it's important that all levels of the game get support from this grant. So that's really important.
Minister, before I call on Emma Harper, can you indicate then, given £10 million covering all of football out with the Premiership, what would you then estimate the likely grant available might be to, let's say, a First Division football club in the SPFL? What are we talking about here in real terms?
So that's the discussions that we're currently having with the SFA. Obviously, we didn't, prior to making the announcement in Parliament last Thursday, it wouldn't have been appropriate to talk to the SFA about any numbers. So those discussions are still ongoing, making sure that the appropriate, from that 10 million pot, and of course, it would always be better if it was more. And I absolutely recognise the higher we could get, but I guess what I would be asking people to remember is that the Barnett consequential from the entire sport budget would be 4.5 million roughly, and we've managed to secure 10 million for football. So that's a sizable pot of money, and we need to make sure we get that split right so that it is having the appropriate effect at every level of football, and that's the work that Andy and his team are doing with the SFA.
Indeed, and do you have a total number of clubs that will be beneficiaries of this grant support across women's football? Highland League, Lowland League, and lower leagues of the SPFL?
It's hundreds, and I don't think Andy would have the best chance to answer this, but I think it's pretty a huge number.
Andrew Sinclair.
The Scottish Football Pyramid. It's down to Tier 7, so that will include the women's game. It will include the junior game, Highland, Lowland, East of Scotland, West of Scotland, South of Scotland. So it's almost every semi-professional league upwards in Scotland. So it'll be a huge number of clubs supported.
200, 300 of that order more?
200 probably. 200. Well, there's 240 in the auspices of the Scottish FA.
Okay, thank you very much. And I now call on Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning again to everybody. I'm interested to know simply, how do clubs apply for funding?
Minister.
Thanks, Emma. That's one of the things that we're finalising with the SFA. Andy, your team have been specifically involved in that. Did we get anything yesterday in terms of those discussions?
Andrew Sinclair.
Yeah, thank you. So that work has essentially been done. So the information gathering and the financial information gathering has been concluded. So we expect it to not be a particularly bureaucratic process, and we'll be able to move pretty quickly. So it'll just be a case of agreeing the allocations with the Scottish FA and then getting the money out the door. So it should be a fairly rapid process.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I'm sure the clubs like Newton Stewart and St Cuthberts and Cleve Rovers will be quite happy to hear that it won't be bureaucratic and it will be quite hopefully easy as well. Another question is simply, how much funding specifically will be provided for women's football?
Minister.
Really important that we make sure that this money reaches all parts of the game, as I said, including the women's game. And I had a meeting with some representatives of the women's game just last week, hearing about actually at all levels. So hearing about how at the very top level of the women's game, they're obviously continuing to play, but nonetheless there are challenges there, right down to the community level, and how some of the clubs are working really hard when they're in level 3 or level 4, they're not able to play, but nonetheless the teams coming together to make sure they're doing something for the community. They're still doing their training and food packages or other similar work. So it's really important that we support all levels of the game, and we are, as you all have been as well, specifically emphasising the women's game, because it's really important we make sure that game is supported. We had such a bounce in the game from, apologies for the pun, after the women's qualifying into the World Cup, and whatever disappointment there was at the end with the final result, it was really exciting, and that's what we want to continue to latch on to that, to make sure we can encourage more girls to get involved in football and continue playing, whether in some sort of a very competitive or semi-professional role, or just for fun, just to keep fit, which is equally as important.
Emma Harper.
Just a final question, really. I suppose it is a COVID-related question, but it's important that the grassroots football does continue, obviously, and especially when parents are desperate to go and watch their kids play as well. So that's really important as we move forward. Luckily for us in the Southwest, we're in Tier 1, so I'm looking forward to further announcements about how we can get the parents involved again, and making sure that there's, the fans get to see their Wains play.
Minister.
No, you're absolutely right. As areas move down down the tier system, then it does provide opportunities. Obviously, we have to make sure we're grasping those opportunities in a way that is safe, because it would be not good if relaxing rules around football then resulted in an increase in COVID numbers and an area then having to move up. So we need to do it carefully, and I know that football clubs across Scotland are really alert to that, and there's a huge amount of work being going on with the Scottish Government, with the SFA, with the Joint Response Group in football, making sure that whatever we're doing it as safely as possible. But as areas come down and prevalence comes down, it does offer opportunities so that we can safely bring a number of activities back. And I know for the south of Scotland, where Emma Harper was representing, obviously Queen of the South is, as I understand, already in discussions with Mr Stewart will be pleased to know, at Invernescally Thistle to discuss their experience to make sure that as football opens up, as level prevalence goes down, that we're sharing that knowledge to make sure that whatever we're doing as safely as possible. So I know there'll be a number of lessons on the island that Scotland will be able to learn from as we move forward.
Thank you very much. And now call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and everyone else. I'll have to declare an interest at this stage as well, that I'm the convener of the St Mirren Independent Supporters Association, who have a 28% share in the club, St Mirren FC, and will be fan-owned by this time next year. I'm also, by looking through the funding package, I'm also honorary president of Paisley Pirates Ice Hockey Club, so one of the oldest clubs in Scotland, so I'll need to mention that as well. But, Minister, one of the things I'd like to ask is, when you were developing this package, what discussions did you have with clubs and governing bodies in advance to developing the package? Because I know how difficult it can be working with the SPFL in particular, and in particular its chief, Neil Doncaster, who is known for flights of fancy from time to time. So I know how difficult it is. So what work did you do in advance with these organisations before you got this funding package put together?
Minister.
So if we think way back to the point when prevalence was getting so high that across the United Kingdom all governments took the decision that the pilots that we were taking forward had to stop, and at that point it was clear that we needed a package to support football and other sports with spectators. At that point, I quickly met with the SFA and SPFL to discuss concerns and to hear their views. And I've met with them on a number of occasions. But obviously, the most important piece of work has been carried out by Active Scotland officials and Sport Scotland officials working with the SFA and others to try and understand the particular challenges that individual clubs at all levels have faced. One of the challenges is that in meetings with football authorities, and we can totally understand why this is, the Premiership perhaps will be disproportionately represented in those kind of meetings. So we have to make sure that we're hearing from all levels of football. We understand why the Premiership is so important in Scottish football. I mean, the Sky TV contract is a huge income resource, so it is really important, and it's important to all levels. What I hope the pandemic has done for football is, and I'm not certain we're quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. I'm hearing noises from a number of senior members in football, which would suggest that I think increasingly people recognise that they need to look at football in the round. So rather than just having a very insular view related to their own particular club, to think about the wider game. And if football as a whole is stronger, then that's going to benefit all teams, including the 12 in the Premiership.
George Adam.
Minister, if you manage to find a way to get clubs across the length and breadth of the country to work together in that way, you're a better man than I am, because I think that's...
In my discussions, I certainly am of the view that there is an increasing number of people at senior levels, and including in the Premiership, who recognise the importance of football at all levels. So I think there is a shift happening, which is really good.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, Minister, because one of the things I was wanting to ask Father Ash is how did your decision process work in terms of splitting the funding payments? Like for myself as a football fan, you've got 20 million for football, 30 million for football, and then my father-in-law is a massive rugby fan, and he'll probably hate me for saying this, but it seems strange that there's 20 million for rugby. So how did you go about actually splitting it between the various sports?
So, as I said earlier, we did a piece of work to try and understand the challenges the different sports and clubs had at all their levels. So reduction in income, the ability to reduce spend, so the ability to furlough, perhaps, for example. plus also tried to understand what existing and continuing streams of money were coming in, and that was the basis of the recommendation that came to me. The most important thing for me, though, was that we were able to make the case that the size of the envelope was significantly larger than what the Barnett consequential would have been, because I think we'd be having a very different conversation if I'd been having to make a decision of how we divide £4.5 million of grant and maybe £20 million of loans across all of sport. Then so that would have been a different conversation, and I would not have had the confidence that we've put in place a package which is going to sustain sport through the pandemic.
Well, I can see the logic. Thank you, convener. Sorry for that. I can see the logic, Minister, on if I take my ice hockey scenario as an example, because the ice is always the most expensive thing for clubs to actually deal with. And you've got 2.2 million there for ice hockey and ice rinks, and 2 million of that goes to the ice time itself, and that does make sense because that is the most expensive cost for these clubs. But just to carry on, Minister, to go into my next question, is there a chance that any club, or are you aware, Minister, of any clubs, football clubs, possibly going out of business because of the pandemic? Is there any close to the line? If I use my own example, surprisingly, St Mum's been a well-run club for 30 odd years, and we're actually doing really quite well considering the challenges we've had ahead. So are you aware of any smaller clubs that might be struggling at this stage?
Minister.
I think that takes me back to the point that Dave Stewart made, that if we didn't have this package, then I think there would be a risk that some really important community clubs would be at risk, and that's partly why we've made sure that the grant funding for football reaches all levels of the game, because it would be devastating if we come out of this pandemic just when we really need to get working in terms of getting people physically active, that part of that resource in terms of our football teams wasn't there, and we had to rebuild from base first tack in terms of having the opportunity for people to take part in physical exercise and sport.
George.
And just one question at this point, Minister, with regards to the funding, is there, like football clubs, different football clubs will have different needs, and the money will be used for different things regardless of, depending on the size of the club. If I can use an example of one project that SMISA funded for St Mum was, we paid for the upgrade of their AstroTurf in their training academy. Would there be any strings attached to any of this funding, or could clubs use it for community hub projects and or use it for things that would make it a lot easier for the club, for capital spend that they possibly couldn't afford at this stage?
Minister.
So obviously the purpose of the fund is to ensure, it's an emergency fund to ensure the survival of those football clubs. I'm really keen that there's as few strings attached to that as possible, because I think ultimately the teams themselves will be best placed to know what's going to make sure that they are able to sustain into the future. Andy, in terms of the discussions that we've had, is there any more you want to add to that?
Andrew Sinclair.
Yeah, as the Minister says, we're trying to make it as unbureaucratic as possible, because recognising clubs are in trouble, this is an emergency fund, and the more strings that we attach to and conditions we attach to that money, the more difficult it becomes and the more diluted the impact becomes. So we're keen to make it as much up to clubs to meet their needs and their costs as possible.
Thank you very much. I now call Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Just before I get on to my questions, I just wanted to highlight that I've spoken to my own local club of Kilmarnock, and they, like Dave Stewart has said, a lot of these clubs are now functioning without a debt, but the COVID testing costs are now costing up to £20,000 a month. They've cut the second team, so they're not running a second team. And bizarrely, they lose money in pay-per-view if they have a televised game. And when the fans come back in, if they come back in limited numbers, they will also lose money in that as well. So it's just to highlight that I think that although this is welcome support to the clubs, a lot of these clubs may not want to take a loan because they don't run a debt and they're under extreme pressure. And one of the questions I asked them is when do you think they will get back to normal? And it will take a considerable period of time. But what I wanted to ask the Minister really was around the other sports. I'm looking at the table and the welcome support you have for other sports. And note there's quite a few of those sports, quite a few of the sports that I've spoken to that are not represented on that table. My own sport, obviously, track and field. We have squash, which have highlighted to me that a lot of squash clubs are under extreme pressure, obviously, because they're designated as a contact sport. We have martial arts in there, we have badminton. So, as you've highlighted, Minister, there's a huge positive impact of sport on individuals, on communities. I think my concern is around the widening of the inequality gap. Can I ask, where is the funding for these sports, and what consideration did you have to go into to support the sports you have and not support the others?
Minister. So thanks, Brian. That is actually a really important question, because on the face of it, you come to that assumption. Obviously, this fund was really specifically to look at those sports which were particularly impacted by the loss of spectator income, and with the exception of the ice sports, in terms of curling, for instance, where there was a particular issue which I think we all recognise, and George Adam mentioned in relation to ice sports. But the rest of the sports that are supported here it's all sports who are particularly impacted by the loss of spectators. But you're absolutely right, there's a whole range of other sports which have been impacted by COVID-19, and we took the decision early on that we needed to plan for that challenge. So those sports have been supported by Sport Scotland. So maybe if I ask Stuart Harris, maybe just to outline the approach that Sport Scotland's taken in terms of supporting sport as a whole.
Stuart Harris.
Good morning. We have had a good relationship with all governing bodies, Brian, as you will know. We took a decision right at the beginning to advance the national governing bodies and local partners £32 million, which had no strings attached, which was based on protecting jobs and survival of each of the sports and their infrastructure. We've also kept in contact with each of those sports, Brian, and set aside another £1.5 million that should track and field, I know it's close to your heart, should track and field have any further difficulty, then we'll make sure that we're able to, in discussion with them, cover those resources. Equally, as this pandemic progresses, we will make sure that, depending on the timescale, we'll continue to look at how we support each governing body, both nationally and locally. So our relationship with all 32 local authorities is key in this respect. So I think there's a lot of support in place. We've asked each governing body to keep us posted on the state and readiness of their clubs, so that if there are difficulties, if there are infrastructure problems, if there are issues with jobs, particularly the professional leadership jobs, then we'd be ready to help and look further at supporting them financially.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. One of the things that really concerns me, and I'm still an active coach, I should declare that, is that over this period, this is going to be a year's time, we'll really have lost, I think, the ability to recruit, and also during the period of time when sport was unable to keep going, there'll be those who have not come back to the sport, if I can put it that way. And in my view, we will need to really consider how we support sports in bringing these people back into the sport, and also going backfilling to those who we haven't recruited into the sport. We've lost a whole year. Can I ask how the Scottish Government plan to look at that? I know it's probably not the priority right this second, but it is coming down the line, and sport is going to be so important going forward. How are we going to recruit, backfill and recruit?
Minister.
So Brian Whittle's question just now, I think, is probably one of the most important questions that we need to answer. as we get through COVID, then he's absolutely right. There's a whole host of people that would have been signed up to various sports who haven't joined clubs, and it goes across all sports. And if we're going to try and tackle the physical and mental health issues that COVID has exacerbated, particularly around inequalities, then we need to challenge that. As I said earlier, I think I had a meeting with the women's, some representatives of women's football last week, and one of the things we discussed, and I think it's something that the committee can help us with, is that at the right time, and you're right, it's not right now, but soon, I think we need to support across Scotland, and I think that includes government, I think it includes the committee, it includes all the sports governing bodies. We need to think about how we take a national approach to encouraging people to get involved with sport. And it might be let's encourage folk to do testers with different sports to rapidly find the right sport for them, whereas normally you might join a club and then you find that sport's not right and join someone else. We need to make all that much faster, but we need to do it together across Scotland. So I think there's a particularly important role for sports governing bodies, obviously, and folk who are actively involved in sport and running clubs, to think how we can make that pitch. But I think there's a role for us in government, obviously, as well, in terms of leadership, but also a role for the committee in that as well. So I'd be really keen to look at how we can work together on this. I think it's so important, the point that Brian Whittle makes about COVID we'll get back to some sort of normal, and we need to make sure that we haven't that we can get folk, we need to get Scotland moving, and sport is so important, encouraging people to take part in physical activity.
Thank you very much. Minister, can I go back to the global sums available under this package and just make sure they're on the record and also that they're understood? I'm looking at the table you've provided, which suggests there is £25 million in loan funding, and of the £25 million in loan funding, £20 million is for Scottish Premiership football clubs and £5 million for rugby. But then there's 30 million of grants or resource funding, 30 million. Half of that is going to rugby, and the rest is distributed among football and all the other sports supported. Now, given that the grant funding is intended to make up for loss of spectator or loss of income as a result of COVID, are you maintaining then that half of the loss of income, which you're addressing through grant funding, half of that loss of income is rugby rather than other sports, Minister?
So the fund is an emergency fund in order to make sure that all of these sports are sustainable through the pandemic. And I can't for a second say that the funding that we've got is replacing the lost income. It can't. And the scheme is not designed to do that. Because I can't do that. And as I said, the Barnett consequential for this fund is something like £4.5 million. So we're having to massively widen that and increase that to support sport. And I'm really pleased that the government is, by having this £55 million fund, government is recognising the importance of all of these sports, not just in terms of the physical activity aspect, but the wider economic and social aspects as well. So, but as we said, in terms of working out where the grants should go and where the loans should go, it was about making sure that all of these sports can be sustainable, and also making sure that for football in particular, for the Premiership, the level of resource that would be required to make a difference at that level was substantial. So that's why £20 million, roughly over 1.6 million per club is a substantial amount of money. And if you compare that to what is happening elsewhere, you can see that what we've done is really significant.
I guess I'm simply a little surprised that 200 football clubs are receiving £10 million in grant support, whereas rugby is receiving 15 million. And I wonder, Andrew Sinclair, how many professional and semi-professional clubs are within that Scottish rugby envelope that will be receiving 15 million of resource funding? Andrew Sinclair.
So just to give a bit of detail, I mean, I think the way in which the two sports are governed are completely different and actually quite difficult to to compare, Scottish Rugby are obviously owners and operators of the two professional rugby teams, Glasgow and Edinburgh, as we know, and owners and operators of Murrayfield BT Stadium as well. They also support, to the tune of approximately £7 million a year, the grassroots infrastructure within rugby. And rugby, given the increased transmission risk around playing rugby, has essentially been suspended at grassroots level. So this funding will ensure the future of both the men's and women's national team for rugby, Edinburgh and Glasgow, but also look to protect that investments in grassroots across the country.
So there's not really a comparable, we're talking in terms of semi-professional football, hundreds of clubs and thousands of players, but in terms of rugby, we're talking relatively small numbers by comparison. That's correct, yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Can I now call again George Adam?
Thank you very much, Convener, and hello to everyone again. This is probably a question, it's not just a football-related question, it's probably with regards to everybody else. It's the whole scenario. There's a situation where, come January, there's a good chance when the transfer window opened that clubs, smaller clubs, because of their financial background, may let some players go, and there may be difficulty in that player trying to get another club. Back in the day when things were okay, pre-pandemic, it would be slightly easier to get another club, but there may be some redundancies. So does the Minister, the Minister will obviously be aware of this, but is there any plans by the Scottish Government to mitigate these potential employment impacts?
Minister.
It's, I think, really important to recognise that when we're talking about the economic impact of football clubs, it's much wider than just the players on the field. And I think most clubs are likely to have a number of people who are still in furlough. So it's good to know that option is available for a bit longer, and obviously encourage the UK government to make sure that continues to be available to football clubs and other businesses for as long as it is required. We're all hoping that this will turn around, and we're all hoping that we get the prevalence of the virus down. The vaccine rollout obviously is one of the bright lights at the end of the tunnel that's getting a little bit brighter. We're all desperate to get back to as much normality as we want. My job as Sports Minister, I think, is to make sure that the clubs are able to survive to get to that point when hopefully we have a positive future and clubs can get back to focusing more on the football than on the small p politics.
Okay. And my final question, Minister, is during lockdown, a lot of the clubs, community development departments and charities did a lot of great work. But the situation is that in Paisley, I'm not saying that all roads lead to Paisley and St Mirren. Well, let's not kid ourselves, I'm actually saying that. But the whole point is that we were very good at working in the community and dealing with young people and everything else. These community development departments have been, over the past 10 years, have developed, and they've been thriving and they've been great in the communities. Has the Minister heard of any of these departments possibly being closed because currently they'll not be able to work as they did before?
Minister.
No, I'm not sure I am, but what I am aware of is that the work that George Adam talked about happening in Paisley is happening in clubs all over the country and at all levels. And football clubs have really stepped up as really important parts of their communities.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Football clubs are an integral part of their community. They cover a wide range of different age groups, engage with them, and like George, I'll mention Raith Rovers, a great club for doing that. And you just see with their football programme for all ages and for women and things like that, Does the Minister recognise that the impact of losing these community hubs on the local population would have a real effect on their physical and mental health?
Minister.
Yeah. So David Torrance is absolutely right that the importance of the football communities, football clubs, particularly in terms of smaller communities, is really, really important, and their reach is far wider than just the football. So some of the work that trusts in particular are doing, it's not just about physical activity. It goes into employment work, helping young folk get confidence to then go to college. One of the things that we support in government in football clubs across Scotland is the fit fans in training work, which is an evidence-based piece of work, encouraging those fans who are maybe a little bit overweight to get physically active, and it's evidence-based that is working where other interventions haven't worked for their particular audience. So I can't overstate how important that work that football clubs across the country are doing, and it's at all levels, including the Premiership. In the Premiership, the convener will be aware of the great work that goes on in Aberdeen Football Club and reaching beyond just the city into the Shire. And that's replicated by other groups across the country. So it's really important. That's why it's so important that we are supporting our sports clubs and football clubs.
David Torrance.
I don't have any other questions, convener.
Thanks very much, Minister. You mentioned Aberdeen Community Trust, and I think that's a good example. Is it your expectation that the loan funding being made available to Premiership clubs will be able to be used to maintain community activity as well as the professional game? Minister.
I think that the funding that we're providing is more likely to be used to make sure the clubs are sustained, but clearly community trusts, they won't continue if the football club's not there. So there's a synergy there. They are separate entities, but the Aberdeen FC and the trust there, it wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the football club. So the thing that brings all those folk together is their passion, like yours, for Aberdeen FC and wearing the red. So I don't really expect the money to flow that way, but nonetheless, I think it's really important.
Thank you very much. But that's a nice segue in the passion for wearing the colours to our final area of questioning, which is around a return of fans to Scottish football. And can I call, first of all, David Stewart?
Thank you, convener. I think this has been a very helpful session. I think we're coming to probably one of the key areas, which is the safe return of fans to football stadia. Certainly my discussion with football teams, the arguments are that they want a hand up rather than a hand out. The key question I have is, when can we have a safe return of fans to football stadia? And if I could flag up the position in England, which is probably always not a good argument for me to put to the Minister, but he'll know that Tier 1 in England are allowed 4,000 fans, and Tier 2 in England are allowed 2,000. In my own club, in Tier 1, of a stadia of around 7,000 capacity, we have 300 are currently allowed. So, of course, we have to follow the science, Minister, but it's the same science that's governing England as is governing Scotland. And I know Jason Leach, who's often quoted in football, often argues about how outdoor is much safer, of course, than indoor. So my key question is, can we have a look at this again? By allowing fans back, we can allow teams to trade out of the financial problems that they have, but we need the fans back safely.
Minister.
And obviously the last word that Mr. Stewart used, safely, is so important. We have seen up to 4,000 fans in stadia in England, and I watched some clips of one of those games. I think it was a game in London, so I think those games, as I understand, will cease, and the whole section of England will not be able to have any fans in. But what I saw, I would be hugely worried about if I saw that in stadia in Scotland. So what I saw was at the start of the game, yes, fans were well socially distanced, being really careful. But then as the game became exciting, doesn't always happen, but when it does happen, it becomes really difficult for us all to be mindful of the rules. And you saw social distancing going really out the window on the clips that I saw. Lots of shouting with all the aerosol generation. So we really need to be careful, because the trouble is that the virus is still out there. And we need to, while prevalence is at the levels it is in some parts of Scotland, we need to be careful that anything that we do that gives the virus the opportunity to pass between households and then for folk to take it back to their household could have the result of causing further community spread of the virus, with all of the implications that we have there. So we have a route map which shows how we can get fans back. We need to get the prevalence down to level 1 areas, as we've done in the Highlands, and so now on a Saturday it is possible in Highland to have 300 fans at Inverness, 300 fans at Ross County, and hundreds of fans in Highland League clubs across the local authority area. And I think that's the way we want to go, is to get more fans back into more stadia across Scotland. Clearly, it's no use to me as a Dundee United fan if there's fans in Ross County and we get 700 fans. What Dundee United fans want is to be able to get a chance at going to see a Dundee United game, preferably a derby. But we need to be really, really careful. We need to be mindful. We've seen levels of the virus go down and then levels of the virus go up. Every time we do something that relaxes our regulations, there's a real risk that we allow the virus to get a grip again and move out. Highlands are doing really, really good today. It would be it'd be awful if we did something that then resulted in the virus spreading across the Highlands and the Highlands being moved into level 2.
David Stewart.
Again, convener, we can perhaps argue about the English litigation another day, Minister, but in terms of the next steps, why don't we continue the model of having pilot games? I think Ross County and Aberdeen had that at one stage. Why not look at more pilot games within the Championship? Obviously, I've got a bias in terms of the Highlands, in terms of Tier 1. I think Cally Thistle, for example, offered to host the Scottish Cup final, which I thought was a very innovative suggestion. Basically, the point I'm making in Tier 1, and I hope to see all the other areas go to Tier 1 eventually, is 300 out of a capacity of 7,000 is an extremely small proportion of that. So we can still have safe attendance at games, but have a more realistic income flow for clubs. Because the bulk of the 300, as the Minister will know, at Ross County and at Elgin and Inverness, will be existing season ticket holders anyway, who've already paid their money. So there's not actually any extra income flow to the club.
Minister.
I mean, I totally get how difficult this is. I'm the Minister for Sport. I saw the smiling faces on the fans in Aberdeen when they were getting one of those golden tickets to go and watch that pilot game. What politician wouldn't want to give that to more people and be the really popular sports minister? But this virus is just so difficult. We need to be so careful that we're not doing something that inadvertently causes the virus to spread around. The suggestion of the cup final was an interesting one. I don't think it ever got to us as government, in that it was against rules, and I think there's particular reasons why that has to be held where it's being held. I just wish I could come and say, yeah, we can do it and we can do this and it'll be safe. We need to be mindful that it's not just the stadia, it's about people getting to the stadia and all the risks there, the pressures that potentially get put on the emergency services, ambulance, police. All of those things need to be considered when we're making decisions. I'm really hopeful that if we can drive the virus down, then we will manage before too long to start getting those numbers up. But we need to all work and focus on getting the prevalence of the virus down across Scotland.
If we take David Stewart's point about pilots, there were pilots at Pittodrie and at Victoria Park in the summer, and the reports, as I understood them, were that they were very safely and securely conducted. Have you learned lessons from those pilots? Can you apply those lessons? Can you increase the number of fans attending a Tier 1 stadium where there are sufficient seats, can you reintroduce fans to Tier 2 on the basis of the kind of precautions that were taken in those pilots, Minister?
So thanks. So the pilots were really important, and I thank Aberdeen and Ross County for carrying out those pilots. It's because of those pilots that we are able to say with confidence that at level 1 we can have 300 fans back, and that's given us that confidence. The challenge and the reason the pilots were stopped was when, if we think back to when we were carrying out the pilots, the prevalence of the virus across Scotland was on a downward trajectory and low, and it was so unfortunate that in the middle of those pilots, there was plans for a pilot in Glasgow, that numbers started to rise, and we had to say to put a halt to a proposed pilot there. The original proposal was that on that day when the game was playing in Aberdeen and also in Dingwall, that there would have been a game in Glasgow as well, but the virus started, the prevalence of the virus started to increase, and it's unfortunately has gone in the wrong direction for some time. We're now looking at a downward trajectory, so we're across the country, we're not at the levels that we were last summer. In most of the country last summer when we were doing the pilots, we'd effectively eliminated the virus, or pretty close to elimination, in many parts of Scotland. We're looking at an entirely different situation just now, but one which is going in the right direction in most parts of the country. So we now do have the borders and Dumfries and Galloway into level 1 and able to get fans back into the games there, and hopefully that will be seen as a bit of light at the end of the tunnel for fans elsewhere in the country, and maybe just a little bit extra boost for us all to work harder to follow the rules and do whatever we can to stop the spread of this horrible virus.
Thank you. I know Aberdeen, and I suspect other clubs, have put to the government very detailed plans for how they could manage numbers in the low thousands of fans safely in the context of the virus prevalence that currently exists. Have you considered those plans carefully and provided a detailed response, or have you simply rejected them out of hand?
So there's a clear route map to getting fans back into the stadia, and that's to get to level 1. What we have to understand is that having fans in stadia, nothing that we do in terms of relaxing regulations is risk-free. And clearly, the higher the prevalence of the virus is in the community, the more likely that someone who's in part of that crowd will have the virus, and that's a risk that we need to judge where the point that risk becomes acceptable. And the government has been clear that we think that at level 1, that's the how far down we need to get the prevalence. One of the things I think people need to recognise is that if you look at the World Health Organization definition for the virus being out of control, there are two definitions. One above 5% of positivity rate, and the other is above 50 cases per week per 100,000. And so that's not level 2. So and in areas, in Aberdeen in particular, where we're now looking at, I think, something around 100 cases. So the idea that we would doing something which would potentially put people at risk in a level which is twice the level that WHO says is out of control, I think that would be irresponsible. And if folk want to go to football, but they want to go to football knowing that it is safe to do so. They don't want to go to football thinking that they're not infected and then find out that they've infected other people, or finding out that they've come back with the virus and then pass it on to a loved one or a grandparent. That's not what people want to know, that what we're doing is safe, and that's what we're trying to do. So that's why we're really encouraging folk to work hard to get the prevalence down. We've done it before, we can do it again.
So if the government's route map is get to Tier 1 and take it from there, is there then a route map for expanding the number in areas like the Highlands beyond 300 at a home game, Minister?
So that's something we need to look at when we get confidence that that what we've put in place just now in terms of the 300 and increasing clubs across the Highlands in particular is working. I think we need to certainly get past Christmas, to see how numbers are flowing. There's obviously a concern about the relaxations that have been allowed around Christmas, and to see how that impacts. The virus has not gone away in the Highlands. It's still there, so everything we do, there's a risk. So we need to manage that risk. The worst thing we could do for the Highlands would be to have a relaxation which then resulted in the virus rising, particularly in our rural and remote communities, and that would be really challenging, and then seeing the Highlands having to move back up into level 2. Nobody wants that.
Thank you very much. I call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. I obviously lied when I said that was my final question. Just when this one opened up, I had a couple of ideas going through my head. Minister, when you said about the pilot, nobody knows more about the disappointment of the pilot not happening, because St Mirren and the Smiza Stadium were going to be one of these pilot areas. But the idea of 300 fans is a good way to be able to actually see that the process works. For clubs to actually be able to work their way out of the situation, there would need to be thousands of fans allowed, and that gives us another problem entirely. And on the back of what you've already said, for a safe return to football, you've got to look at the game day experience that many fans do experience. And a lot in our case, not so much myself because Stacey won't allow me, but many of my friends and colleagues will go into the town centre, make a day of it. But the problem would be if you've got thousands of fans going, and I've spoken to the Chief Executive of St Mirren, Tony Fitzpatrick, on this, would be that we would be allowing fans, or fans would have a window of opportunity to go to the game from noon onwards. Say it was a 3 o'clock kickoff. So many fans could be sitting there in the middle of winter from about 12:30 in the afternoon for a game that doesn't start till 3. Now, that also gives us some logistical problems, because my concern would be that groups of individuals who sit in the same seat or are close to one another, if you've got thousands of fans going to the game, effectively would turn up with all their friends at the one time, and the worst case scenario would be everybody rocking up at 2:45 like they normally do in normal times. Would that be a concern of yours as we go forward, and how do we address that?
Minister.
Clearly, concerns around larger numbers of fans aren't just about the numbers of fans. Technically, if you were to use the whole of a stadium, you could spread people out so that even if they were getting excited and being a bit less careful than they should be, but they weren't in close proximity of somebody else. But there is the other issues in terms of people getting to the stadia, and the additional pressures on the wider system, so transportation system, police, ambulance, all of those pressures need to be taken account of as well, and that's why we've come to the number of 300, and we need to build confidence that that's working, and particularly in terms of with a wider range of football teams. So it is really good that in the Highlands that it's not just Inverness and Ross County, but also increasing numbers of Highland League teams. Obviously, the Highland League teams are going through a process to make sure that as they do bring fans in, that they're able to do that safely. And so it's not actually as simple as me saying it's okay. They're working with football authorities to make sure that they've got robust plans in place. And there's a huge amount of collaboration. This is partly why the question earlier about having a wider concern for football, that's partly why I have confidence, because I know that there is a good degree of collaboration between the teams in terms of best practice to make sure that those smaller Highland League teams that are starting to bring fans back in are learning from the other teams to make sure they can do that as safely as possible. And I most recently heard that Inverness Cally Thistle were discussing with Queen of the South to make sure that Queen of the South learned from their experiences.
Thank you very much. And I call Sandra White. Oh, we're not.
Is that okay?
Carry on.
As everyone else is calling out their local football teams, I'll give a shout out for my local constituency football team, Partick Thistle. who have been working very, very hard in the community before the pandemic, and obviously on the pandemic as well, and I thank them very much for that. I wanted to move on slightly in regards to the return of football fans to the stadium. Now, we have had news that hopefully and thankfully we will have a vaccine against COVID-19. Now, this vaccine is apparently going to be able to be put out to people in the new year, January, etc. And I just wondered, Minister, would you be anticipating a return of fans, a large return of fans to football stadiums once this vaccine becomes available? And on the back of that, if the vaccine is available and fans are able, or public are able to get that vaccine, would they need a certificate? Anyone, would they need a certificate to say they had received the vaccine before they could enter the stadiums? So it's a good news, a positive part of the, obviously what's happening in football and elsewhere. But I just wonder if you could answer those questions, or do we have concerns in regards to that?
Minister.
So thanks, Sandra, for that question. You're right, it's good news, and it's really good news. So the vaccine that we currently have, and there's other vaccines on the way, none of the vaccines, as I understand, have done the research necessary to tell us that when you've been vaccinated, you won't still potentially be infectious and make somebody else infected. What's really good is that all of the evidence from the vaccines that are coming forward, and some of them it's preliminary evidence, that they all appear to be really good at protecting the individual from serious illness, hospitalisation, and potential death. And that's really good. And so that's why, in terms of the rollout of the limited stocks of vaccine that we currently have, it's targeted at those folk that are most vulnerable, because we really want to protect the most vulnerable. And if we take in all the priority groups that the JCVI have recommended, then that will protect 99% of the people most likely to die from COVID. That's a prize in itself, but it doesn't give us the confidence that because you've been vaccinated, you won't spread the virus to somebody else. There's good reasons to think it probably will be helpful, but the evidence isn't there yet. So the idea of providing someone with a certificate, which might imply that they didn't pose a risk and they could somehow act differently, we're not there yet. We should get there. As time goes on, evidence base will build, and I guess we're all really hopeful that we get that evidence and we have the certainty that being vaccinated doesn't just protect yourself, but it protects others. And that's one of the things, in terms of when we tell people to take most vaccines, that's one of the points. It's not just for you, it's for your granny too, in terms of the flu vaccine. So I'm hopeful, but we're not yet there yet. So the idea of a certificate would, I think, be making going a stage further than the evidence takes us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If I may come back, Convener.
Yes,
thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Minister. I think it's really important that we clarify this issue about vaccines. And I did say it's good news, and it is good news, but I think the general public, particularly we're talking about football at the moment and fans going there, I think they really need to know that this is not a cure-all in regards to they can't pass it on to anyone. So I know that fans from all over will be thinking, we've got a vaccine, we'll be able to go. You've mentioned about the certificate. Is there some way that yourself or officials will be able to clarify that more when fans start to ask, and football clubs start to ask about, well, we've got a vaccine, but we need a message out there to say that actually it protects you, but it doesn't protect everyone. And is there a possibility of, a date in the future where we feel we may get these other vaccines which will protect other people as well? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I just wondered if you have any indication in regards to that.
Minister.
Unfortunately, I would be speculating to suggest how long it's going to take. Not necessarily different vaccines, it's the evidence base that we don't currently have. DCMO Nicholas Steedman has been doing, I think, a great job in terms of trying to explain some of this on a number of outlets. I know I'd certainly appreciate her frank way of expressing the limitations of the vaccine. I think one of the things that we have to do as government, though, is make sure that we're not inadvertently feeding the misinterpretation of what the vaccine can do, and I think that's why I'm instinctively opposed to the idea of having vaccine certificates, because I think that implies a degree of protection to others that is not there. In terms of fans, though, one of the actual, I'm just thinking, one of the positives for fans around the vaccine is that there will be a group of vulnerable fans who, without the vaccine, would not have probably had the confidence to go and be one of those 300 people at a football match. So having been vaccinated and having that degree of protection, there might be some really vulnerable people who might get to have that amazing pleasure that we saw. And I'm talking about Aberdeen because it was Aberdeen that was on the telly, so it was Aberdeen fans that I saw the smiles on their face when they got those tickets and knew that they were going to get to go in and watch their team playing. So the vaccine will mean that a few folk who might otherwise have thought it was too risky will be able to benefit from that.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. And clearly you have spotted the sunny disposition, which is always characteristic of Aberdeen supporters. And on that happy note, we will conclude this session for the moment. I think there are one or two further questions that colleagues may want to put, and if you're content, Minister, I will write to you with those in due course. Can I thank the Minister and his officials for your attendance this morning. We will take further evidence on this inquiry from those involved in delivering and participating in community sports in January, and I know the government will be interested in that session too. So thank you very much for that. And we now move on to the next item on our agenda, which is consideration. Agenda item number 5 is subordinate legislation, consideration of a made affirmative instrument. As in previous weeks, these regulations relate to coronavirus and international travel and are laid under Section 94(1) International Travel of the Public Health Scotland Act 2008, as they have been made on the basis of being emergency regulations but need then to be approved by Parliament, that falls to us to do, to consider these regulations and report to Parliament accordingly. We will therefore do that today, and once again we will hear from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, who will be accompanied by officials. The instrument we are looking at today is the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Amendment number 24 regulations. These remove Latvia and Estonia from the exemption list. They add a number of countries and territories to the exemption list, and they also amend the additional provisions which were made in respect of travellers arriving from Denmark by previous set of regulations. Can I welcome to the committee once again Hamza Yousaf, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, who is accompanied by Craig Thompson, the Border Measures Review Team Leader, James Boyce, Unit Head, Health Performance and Delivery, and Peter Brown from the Police Enforcement Liaison and Performance Team. Can I ask any members who have questions for the Minister to enter in the chat box now? And Minister, I wonder if I could ask you first of all to outline what it is you made special provision for in relation to Denmark in the number 22 regulations, what you are changing this time, and why that change of approach. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, and good morning to you, Convener, and good morning to all committee members, and my thanks to you for being able to speak to these regulations. So you remember, and I won't rehearse too much of this, but you remember the reasons why we effectively introduced, effectively a travel ban was introduced for those visitors travelling back and forth between Denmark. That was, of course, done by the UK government and the powers that they have reserved to them, but we absolutely agreed with the approach that they took, and the reasons for that, again, as you remember, was that there was a mink mutation of the virus that was found in North Jutland in Denmark, which was causing some real concern at that point, some real concern that it could interfere with the efficacy of any vaccine in particular. So that was placed, as well as a whole range of other restrictions in relation to Denmark. You remember the sectoral exemptions, for example, that exist. They were removed for Denmark. So because further detail has emerged in terms of the control of that mink mutation, it was thought that the travel ban, the effective travel ban for visitors, could be listed. However, these regulations make it clear that Denmark is still not exempt from quarantine measures, so travellers still have to quarantine for what is now 10 days. Again, you may know the change that has come in relation to the isolation period from 14 days to 10 days. Airline crew also will be able to travel into the UK from Denmark as part of their operating aircraft crew. They'll no longer have to self-isolate as they would have had to have done before, because the exemption for airline crew and indeed the other exemptions that are in place now include Denmark. So essentially Denmark has now, because of these regulations, reverted back to being a country that is not in the travel corridor list, but has no additional restrictions placed on it other than that.
Thank you very much. And you referred to the reduction in the quarantine period from 14 days to 10 days. Clearly all the regulations we've considered up to now have been on the basis of a 14-day period. Will this require further regulations to come to this committee, or is it a matter that will be dealt with elsewhere? Cabinet Secretary.
No, it's been done. No, it won't have to be done specifically for international travel because it is related to another regulation. Therefore, when that regulation, which has, I think, been discussed and debated, but forgive me if it hasn't, but nonetheless, it's come into force since yesterday, so there will be no separate regulation, is my understanding. But forgive me, officials may want to come in and just correct that, but I think my understanding is that there wouldn't be a requirement for separate regulations in this regard.
Thank you very much. If any officials wish to make a comment, Craig Thompson. Craig Thompson, yeah.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The change to affect the isolation period from 14 to 10 days was included in the regulations introduced last week along the travel corridor changes. So at some point, perhaps next week or into the new year, they'll be considered by the committee, but there's no independent set of regulations to make that change. It was included in last week's travel corridor changes.
Thank you very much. That clarifies the position. I have no further questions from colleagues, so we will now move to agenda item 6, which is the formal debate on the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Amendment number 24 regulations. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 23535. Cabinet Secretary.
I will move motion S5M 23535 in my name. I don't know if I have an option to speak at this point, or is that...
You certainly may. Absolutely, please do.
Yeah, it's simply just to say, Convener, that my thanks to the committee for their scrutiny of these regulations. I have been in discussions with my colleague Michael Matheson over the last couple of weeks. Most of the committee's focus now, quite understandably, has moved on from the enforcement issues, and hence why I was leading on travel regulations around enforcement and issues of Police Scotland enforcement in particular. I think the issues have moved on to ones that, as you've just demonstrated, focus on potentially test and release and measures that will need to be taken forward in discussion with airports and airlines. And as such, I've asked my colleague Michael Matheson, who leads on the domestic travel regulations, to also lead on the international travel regulations. And I'm pleased, after a couple of weeks of discussion, that he has agreed to take over the lead responsibility for also international travel regulations as well, hence why he wrote to you last week. So my thanks to the committee members for the scrutiny. Obviously that detailed scrutiny will continue with Michael Matheson attending the committee, and of course if the committee ever wanted me to attend on issues specifically focused on perhaps issues around compliance, if there was ever an issue, or enforcement I should say, then I'd be happy to of course attend in the future. But this should, he says, touch would be my last appearance at Health and Sport Committee.
Thank you very much, and in that case I thank you for your many appearances over recent months to give evidence on these matters. Clearly, it's a case of a new year and a new minister, and we look forward to scrutinising your colleague in due course. Can I invite any members who wish to speak in relation to the debate to indicate now? If not, then, and the Cabinet Secretary, you have nothing further to add? Nothing further to add from the Cabinet Secretary. In that case, let me put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 23535 be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. We will therefore, that concludes consideration of this instrument, and we will therefore report to Parliament accordingly. And thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their attendance today. Thank you very much once again. We now move on to item 7 on our agenda. This is an evidence session with NHS Borders as part of the committee's ongoing scrutiny of health boards and special health boards. And I welcome to the committee Karen Hamilton, the Chair, Rafe Roberts, Chief Executive, Nikki Berry, Director of Nursing, Midwifery, AHPs and Operations, and Andrew Bone, Director of Finance at NHS Borders. And we will move straight to questions. And if I can start by asking the Chair to give us an indication of the position in relation to the overall financial position of NHS Borders. Karen Hamilton. We may have some difficulty with Karen Hamilton's sound. If it may be then that we should go instead to Rafe Roberts and ask. Can I ask Mr. Roberts in general in relation to the current COVID pandemic, if you can give an indication of the cost to date of additional measures required to manage the pandemic in the borders, and where these additional costs have been incurred. Rafe Roberts. Rafe Roberts. No, we're having little luck with NHS Borders this morning. In that case, I am bound to go to Andrew Bone, Director of Finance.
Hi there. Thank you, Chair. I'll just maybe answer that question, if that's all right. So, in terms of our costs incurred to date, we are around about £6 million of expenditure in the year to date. Basically, that's direct expenditure in response to COVID. It's across a number of areas. It's a combination of public health and infection control measures, including social distancing measures in hospitals. It includes a reconfiguration of our bed base within the Borders General Hospital, and a number of actions also undertaken in the community to manage resilience in care homes, for example. Biggest elements probably at this stage are our acute bed base. We have implemented additional beds for COVID specifically and had a change in our staffing model. As a result, we've also introduced across the board in order to deal with some of the initial phase when we had staff who were on effectively shielding measures or otherwise, increased sickness absence during that period, etc. So that's broadly it. I guess testing is probably something that I would highlight in terms of the costs and expansion of the testing service during that period. And as we're now entering into another phase, we're just starting to see the costs of remobilisation of services come through as well, and our winter planning and our flu planning.
So you've described the additional costs that have arisen as a result of this year's particular circumstances. Clearly, even before then, both NHS Borders and the Health and Care Partnership were under financial pressure, and seeking to manage through brokerage. Is it your view as Director of Finance of the Board that you will be able to continue to manage with the level of brokerage agreed before COVID-19? Andrew.
Yes, we've worked closely with Scottish Government throughout the period prior to the onset of COVID. We had described a financial plan that saw a reducing level of brokerage over the next 3 years, basically, but an ongoing requirement as we started to implement some of our turnaround plans. At the moment, our expectation in this year is that the level of brokerage we described in our financial plan would still be required at that level. But the additional support and constant dialogue we're having with Scottish Government colleagues and the finance team there gives us a measure of comfort that we should be able to live within that, and we might yet see some slight movement between that or downwards, I would suggest, at this stage.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Can I just check, Mr. Roberts, first of all, are you connected and able to confirm that you're in communication with us? If Roberts.
Hello, convener.
Good. That's good to know.
Members. Yep, I can. Thank you.
Excellent.
Sorry,
thank you very much.
apologies for that.
That's quite all right. The perils of online meetings are ones we know too well. I'm Karen Hamilton, the chair of NHS Borders. Can I also confirm whether you are also now connected? Karen Hamilton. Well, 1 out of 2 is progress. We will hopefully be able to hear from the chair in due course. Can we go now to question 4, and I'll call to our next set of questions. Can I call Emma Harper? Emma Harper.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, everybody. I'm interested in a little bit of winter planning and then and COVID numbers. We've heard about a recent outbreak of COVID cases in the borders. I'm wondering if any demand or any pressures from second wave or additional little outbreaks of COVID-19 infections, are they matching how you're able to manage all of this processes as we head into further winter and winter planning?
Rafe Roberts.
Thank you. I'll maybe bring Nikki Berry, Director of Nursing, in a moment, but I think to start with, I think it would be worth emphasising that, I mean, I suppose this winter is a winter like no other, so we are managing a number of contributory factors. We're dealing with the normal issues we would have in any winter. We've obviously got COVID adding additional pressure. Alongside the COVID patients coming through our services, we've also got to manage the vaccination programs, test and protect, the testing of our staff, also the work that we're doing to support care homes and social care in terms of the quality of service that they're providing. And then obviously we also need to be aware of any potential issues associated with Brexit. And I think we also need to be aware that in terms of winter this year, we need to recognise, because of the pressure across the whole system, and particularly some of the pressures within social care, that the flow of patients through our system is likely to be slower this year than it may have been in a normal winter. So all of those add up to a significant set of coincidental risks that we need to manage as a whole. You're right to reflect the fact that over the last week we've had a significant number of cases within the Borders General Hospital, and we've got a system in the moment in terms of our COVID planning that we've got a series of COVID wards that we can open as additional COVID patients are identified. We currently have our first 2 COVID wards open, and I suppose where we are at the moment is we're right on the transition between needing to move into our third COVID ward. The issues obviously in managing that is ensuring that we've got enough staff across the hospital to manage all of that, but also I think it's important to be aware that for us, when we move into our third COVID ward, that is the ward that up until now has been our green, clean pathway for routine elective patients. And so if we need to move into our third COVID ward, if our numbers continue to increase, then that would mean we would need to step down our routine elective activity, which obviously has an impact on the non-COVID harm that we would have in the system. Hope that gives you a useful overview.
That's very helpful. Nikki Berry. I'm afraid we're not hearing from Nikki Berry either, so we may have to come back to her. Clearly, there may be, because of the issues we're having with connections with NHS borders, it may be that some of the evidence we hear today will be supplemented by additional input from the chair and perhaps Nikki Berry as well. But we shall see what can be done, and we'll invite written comment if necessary. Can I go back to Emma Harper? Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I'm sure that we will be able to get written responses if the sound is a challenge. I have seen amazing work by our Scottish Health Service staff, and I think everyone should be thanked for doing an amazing job. And I am concerned that if we're managing outbreaks and the teams are adapting and everybody's basically hit the ground running and continue to run since March this year, or even at the end of February. So I'm wondering what role the board has in managing the little outbreaks, but also supporting the staff members as well.
Rafe Roberts.
I think that is a really important point, and it's one that we are very aware of as a board. And I think it's important that we all understand that in many ways the pressure the staff are under at the present time going into winter is probably a lot higher than it has been throughout this pandemic. And we're obviously dealing with that, having had staff who've been now at this for 9 months. So I think that does give us very significant concerns, and we recognise, notwithstanding the benefits that we can see coming from the vaccination, that we will be at this for at least another 3 months, if not longer. So I think it's a really important aspect that we are conscious of. I think we also need to recognise that staff have responded to this in an incredible way, and as leaders of the organisation we're incredibly proud and thankful for the way they've responded. But also we have to acknowledge that staff will react to this in different ways depending on their own personal circumstances and their own reaction. So we just need to be aware of that and allow staff to have the space and the time to sort of de-pressure at the point that that's right for them. Throughout the pandemic response, we've run a specific focus of work around staff wellbeing, which has been led by our employee director, and we've been really careful to make sure that we've involved staff in that. We put additional support in, we put additional psychological support and space for staff to be able to break out. As we came out of the sort of initial wave during the summer, we've also run a programme of work which we've called Collecting Your Voices, which is a bottom-up approach to getting staff feedback and views of how things have felt for them and what they think we need to do next. And that's given us some important lessons that we can take into the next stage. Some of those were about the impact it had of staff particularly being moved from one team to another, and maybe the additional support we needed to give to people when they were working in teams and departments that they weren't used to working in. So that's something we're very aware of as we go through the next phase, but it is something that we will continue to be very, very focused on as we go through the rest of this year.
Emma Harper.
Thank you for your response. I think we do need to obviously continue to monitor that. There's been a couple of little outbreaks that I'm reading about, Greenlaw, Jedburgh, and other localised little outbreaks. So what role does the board have in managing the wee specific outbreaks? Is that about like engaging outwardly, public education, things like that?
Rafe Roberts, and could you also perhaps mention the current position regarding the outbreak at Borders General Hospital as well? Rafe Roberts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I suppose we've got a number of roles. There's one of the roles is the one you've just mentioned, which is really important that we make sure that the public get good information about what's currently going on and help them to then make the right choices about their own behaviour and the way they comply with the controls that are in place, but also make sure they're aware of the risks around what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. The other really important work that we are involved in is the work our public health team do in conjunction with other partners, particularly the local authority, in managing individual outbreaks, and that will depend to some extent on the individual nature of the outbreak in terms of who they engage with. So if the outbreak's in a commercial premises, that might be slightly different in terms of the individuals who would be involved compared to with whether it was in social care or in a care home or within the hospital. But we have a very well trusted and practiced public health protection response to any of those outbreaks, which include our public health team leading problem assessment groups, which is where they first collect the information about an outbreak, and if the outbreak is significant, that would move into an incident management team, which our public health team would lead. That will involve both other staff from our infection control team, but also from the council. If it's linked to social care, then obviously social care managers would be involved, the emergency planning officers from the council, senior leaders from the senior staff from the council, and we do that on a daily or more than daily basis, depending on the scale of the outbreak, and that is a very well run process. Does require an awful lot of input, and they will on a daily basis look at the control measures that are in place, try and understand what the reasons for transmission are, obviously link into the information that they're getting through the Test and Protect service around exactly what numbers are, who they are, what the contacts are, and they collect all of that information and then try and make sure that we've got the appropriate controls in place. And I think that linked to that, there is a sort of wider question in there about the significant impact and lessons we've learned and relationships we can continue to build on throughout all of this in terms of our working with partners, and that may be something we come back to later on. If you want to just me specifically just in relation to the Borders General Hospital, we became aware about 10 days ago that there were some positive cases identified in one of our wards. So we applied the same health protection approach to that in terms of having daily incident management teams, testing of other patients within the adjacent beds and bays that those patients were in, testing of all of the staff in the wards, and trying to put in place additional mechanisms to make sure that we can manage that outbreak as effectively as possible.
Thank you. Nikki Berry, I don't know if there's anything you would want to add on either of those aspects. Nikki Berry. Oh, perhaps not at the moment. If I can move on, and I will call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. In Borders NHS's submission, they said that the board listed a number of positive changes had emerged because of the pandemic, and you mean to retain that. Now that's great, but my question would be the simple one is, why did it take a worldwide pandemic to improve service?
Rafe Roberts.
Bit of a loaded question. I mean, I think there's a number of things in there, isn't there? I mean, we continually improve service, but I think we would all understand in terms of sort of principles of change methodology that part of the process of managing change is the willingness or the understanding people have of the need for change. And one of the things that I think we has been really important to reflect on as we look back over the COVID response, particularly at the initial phase, and our staff have said this back to us quite a lot, is that one of the things that they really found helpful in terms of managing change and making decisions was the fact that we had a very clear common purpose, which was to address the outcome of the pandemic. And that allows you then to be much more specific around your prioritization of decisions and the pace at which people accept decisions need to be made, and their willingness to go along with those decisions, recognizing that that might not have been what they would have previously said that they would do, or they would have maybe had more conversation about whether the pros and cons and the balances, etc., of any particular decision. So I think there is a lesson for all of us in there about that real importance in terms of prioritization and being really clear what our purpose is, and at any particular time what the priority is. But certainly some of the things that we were able to put in place in terms of virtual appointments, etc., in particular, maybe as an example, we were able to do that because staff recognised it was an absolute necessity, but also our patients accepted it was an absolute necessity and it was to their benefit in that time, and maybe they were willing to accept changes to the way services were provided in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise been willing to accept those. So I think it is recognising the sort of cultural and the human dimension to change, I suppose, which was fundamentally affected by us being in a pandemic. I think the other thing I would say is, sorry, I'll stop and
carry on. No, carry on.
I suppose the only other thing I would say is that a number of the changes, like our wish to use more virtual technology, but also some of the things we were talking about in terms of looking at the way we manage our bed base and whether or not patients are cared for in the acute sector or more patients are supported in the community. I suppose that was also accelerated. So a number of these were part of our longer term transformation program that flowed out of not only the financial issues that we had, but also our long-term plan or long-term strategy to shift care into the community, and this accelerated the need to do that, and so we were able to move forward faster maybe than we had up until now.
George Adam.
Thank you for that, Mr. Roberts. I would have thought you would have had a clear common purpose in pre-COVID as well, but never mind. I'll ask, what specifically did the leadership team do to A, to empower staff, and B, to improve collaboration across health and social care partners? Because that's always been one of the issues that we've been talking about for years, about how we should all make it a lot easier and bring down barriers, but it's always been an issue. So what have you done during this period to actually do that?
Rafe Roberts.
If I can just comment on the common purpose, I think it's important we all recognise that the delivery of health and care is a very complex set of issues, and we have a significant level of competing demands at all times. The point about a common purpose during the COVID pandemic is that there was, particularly at the beginning, a very clear single purpose, which was make sure we have as much capacity available as possible so that we could address the potential increase in COVID patients. And that meant that we stepped down other services, and our whole focus was around how do we create enough capacity to deliver against the potential level of COVID patients. So that's the point I had about a common purpose. That isn't to say that we don't have a clear set of corporate objectives, a clear set of priorities, but having a clear set of priorities and having a single thing that you are dealing with is a different context. In terms of what we did, and certainly we've had some of this has been fed back to us by our staff. We instigated the normal sort of pandemic response we would have, which would reflect the response to any major incident.
I was worrying if that was me there, convener.
No, I don't think so. I think Mr. Roberts has dropped off the call, or at least that would appear to be the case. I wonder if Can I just check whether Karen Hamilton is on the call now? Karen Hamilton. No, I think we don't have the chair or the chief executive, but we do have Mr. Bowen, happily. Andrew Bowen.
Hi there. I'll try and finish Rafe's point for him, and I hope I'll hit the key points. So what Rafe was describing in terms of our pandemic response, or our response to any kind of emergency, we stepped up our pandemic committee and our gold, bronze and silver command structure, basically, which meant that there were frequent routine meetings held daily in the initial phase and then stepped down to sort of every other day. And we're currently running with our pandemic committee on a weekly basis, but continue to review that. So that meant that there was a constant connection between the direct operational management of every element of the service into that pandemic committee, and very specific. Now that's obviously a significant burden in terms of managerial time. It's not something that we operate in a normal phase, but what it meant was that we were constantly communicating, constantly bringing together the different tiers of management in the organisation. In addition to that, in terms of working with our partners, we have weekly calls and informal calls out with that as well, our relationship with our council colleagues. And obviously with the changes to the chief nurse responsibilities, Nikki Berry in particular works very closely with social care colleagues around care homes, but also in general we have a very close working relationship at the moment, and have done really over the last 9 months or so, on a almost daily or certainly weekly basis, constant communication around planning for community services and responding to any issues within those environments. So I think it's really been about the structural aspect in the first instance, but it's also just been that those same common purposes that Rafe described in relation to the health system have also brought us together with health and social care as a wider system as well.
Thank you very much. And Nikki Berry.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Oh, hello. Hi. Morning, everybody. Just to join, to add to what Andrew's saying, I think the leadership has been clinically, this pandemic, this is something that we've planned for, but actually facing the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously been new to all of us. So very much clinically led and clinically driven. So what we've done across the 3 clinical boards is the clinicians have actually been involved in the planning for the response. So the initial planning, which was very, it was rapid. We had to immediately scale up our ITU. We had to quadruple ITU. We had to open, 9 COVID wards. We had to open a COVID hub. So we've had to be really fast and rapid, and it's been clinically led and driven every time. And that's been all the clinical directors in the acute division, the clinicians in mental health, the GPs in primary and community services, and also making sure that we linked as a board, because we are, we're not a huge board. We have the Board of General Hospital, 4 community hospitals, and we have our mental health service, which has 3 inpatient wards as well. So just to say that what we did initially was myself, Rafe, the general managers, the associate nurse directors, they held meetings with staff. We did regular comms we did daily comms about what was actually happening with the pandemic, how we were preparing. We shared the plans with the senior medical. So really just making sure that communication was key, because it was just changing everything, everything changed sometimes, hourly to just had to respond to that, and very much making partnership with our health and social care colleagues. And as Andrew mentioned, we have a weekly meeting now between health and but actually in the midst of the pandemic it was a daily meeting.
Thank you very much. George Adam.
That's all my questions. Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I was really interested around your submission, which suggested that your cancer referrals and treatment have remained a priority throughout the pandemic. You also indicate your outpatient activity has suffered, and only 40% of outpatients are having appointments compared to pre-COVID performance. And your anticipation, as you suggest, will worsen as primary care capacity increases, which is not being matched by the capacity in secondary care. I think the remobilisation of mental health services is detailed as showing that the CAM service is running at 60% capacity in community mental health teams at 75%, which I think you would agree is worrying considering the increase in mental health issues through the COVID pandemic. So can I ask if the board are able to follow its remobilisation plans as expected, and if not, what are the challenges, and why weren't they able to be predicted?
Rafe Roberts.
Thank you. I think this is a really important area for us to be cited on. And I think it's something we all need to understand, that the long-term impact of the COVID pandemic on our services will take a considerable amount of time to address. And we need to recognise that the harm that is therefore there as a result is not just about the potential impact of patients who have COVID and the impact on them, both in the short and potentially the long term, but also on our other patients. Coming out of last year, if we hadn't gone into the pandemic right at the end of March, we would have hit our waiting times targets, and we would have had a very small number of patients who are waiting longer than 12 weeks for either their first outpatient appointment or their treatment time under the treatment time guarantee to come in and receive a procedure. The reality is, because, as you've pointed out, we are not able to remobilise all of our services up to 100% of previous activity levels. We have seen a very significant increase in the routine patients who are waiting. I think the thing we're very pleased with is that we've been able to sustain all of our emergency and cancer work throughout the pandemic, and that has been really, really important. But we shouldn't underestimate the impact that this will have on patients who've been waiting for more routine procedures, and the numbers for that is continuing to grow, particularly those waiting longer than 12 weeks, and now some waiting a significant number waiting for more than 26 weeks, and that is going to continue to grow through till at least March next year, depending on when we will be able to get back to a position where we are running services normally. I think Nikki Berry might want to come in and give a bit more context in terms of why that is the case in terms of capacity. But I think it is important that people understand that just the process of seeing patients has changed, and therefore it takes longer to see each individual patient because of the requirements around PPE, etc. We have had to move staff out of a number of our services to support the essential COVID response, both in terms of capacity in the hospital, but also things like Test and Protect and the vaccination programme, etc. So unfortunately, it is a reality that we will see lower levels of routine activity until we are through the pandemic response, and that is then going to take a considerable period of time for us to address those backlogs, and that will take months, if not longer, to address that backlog, because it will be a very significant backlog, and I don't think we should shy away from the fact that that is the reality.
Nikki Berry. We may have lost Nikki Berry. I'll go back to Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I think that, I think we would all appreciate the pressure that COVID has put on many of the services, but I think it's around this idea of suggesting that cancer referrals and treatment remain a priority, but obviously the performance doesn't match that. So I think it's around managing expectation there. But can I ask, the indication there is that this improved capacity in primary care that's not being matched by the secondary care to deal with the backlog. I wonder maybe if that's something you would comment on in terms of dealing with the pandemic.
Rafe Roberts.
Yes, if I can. Yeah, thank you very much. If I can just comment on the cancer one, absolutely. As I said, we've been able to sustain our cancer performance throughout the pandemic. So I think it's really important that we recognise that, and I'm really grateful to the staff for their focus on that. And we've delivered against our cancer targets this year to a very similar level to that we have done in the past. I think the issue that we've experienced over the course of this pandemic in terms of the routine activity is obviously right at the beginning we stopped doing routine procedures in the hospital as everywhere did, and therefore we had a number of patients on our waiting list who at that point will have waited less than 12 weeks, and they obviously moved along the curve, if you like, and they ended up waiting longer than 12 weeks because we weren't doing any activity. The thing we saw at the initial part of the pandemic as well, of course, was that primary care focused its attention particularly around COVID, and therefore patients who might otherwise have gone to see primary care and then been referred on to secondary care weren't going to see their GP, and therefore the number of referrals coming in from primary care practices, services into the hospital also dropped. So although we were seeing more people waiting because we weren't able to operate routinely, the number of patients being referred initially went down. Obviously, as we began to remobilise services, primary care began to be able to see patients again, and their referral rates have begun to move back up to what you would normally expect the referral rate from primary care to be. So I think it is important to emphasise again throughout this that primary care continued to provide services and was there to see anybody who needed to be seen urgently, albeit that they were doing that in a different way. But obviously, as referrals from primary care have begun to move back up to their normal level towards where you would expect them to be, if we are only then taking off 40, 50, 60% of patients compared to our normal level, then you get a disconnect between the number of patients being referred in and the number of patients we're being able to treat at the other end of the waiting list, if you want to describe it as that. And that's therefore creating this disconnect between the number of patients being added to the waiting list and the number of patients we're able to take off.
Thank you very much. I think at the moment we're still having some technical difficulties, so I intend to suspend the meeting for 10 minutes in order to allow those technical issues to be resolved. So I will now close this meeting for 10 minutes suspension. Thank you very much, and we will now resume the meeting of the Health and Sport Committee. And can I ask Brian Whittle if he still has a question to ask of our witnesses? Brian Whittle.
Thank you, convener. I was looking at the thankfully relatively low COVID-19 activity you have in the area, and I wonder if you, with that in mind, can you explain why the performance in relation to outpatients and inpatients waiting for treatment continues to be such a problem?
Rafe Roberts.
I think, well, there's a couple of things I suppose I would say around that. I think we need to be careful when we say the rate of COVID activity is so low, and that is certainly not an impression I would want to give to our local community. And if you look at the numbers over the last week, the rate per 100,000 has doubled from 30, well, more than doubled. So I think we have to be very careful around that. I think the broader bit, and I'll maybe see if I can bring Nikki Berry in on this, is the reality of regardless of the level of activity, COVID activity that is in the community, the implication that there is some COVID cases in the community means for the way in which we provide services in a way that keeps patients safe when they come into the hospital or when they go into primary care, but also keeps our staff safe, because regardless of whether or not we know whether a patient is definitely COVID or not, we still have to behave. Patients coming into the hospital may be COVID, may have COVID, and therefore it's the impact on our staff of the way in which they manage patients through the system that is having the impact on the percentage of patients that we're able to treat compared to what we did before. And as I said before, we've also got our staff delivering a number of other services that we wouldn't have had to previously provide, and therefore that has an impact on the level of activity. But I don't know if Nikki would want to come in and talk a little bit more about the actual practicalities of providing services in a COVID-safe way.
Nikki Berry.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we are as a board, we're challenged by this as well, Brian. But I think what we've had to do is we've lost 60% of our waiting rooms. So if patients are having to come in for a face-to-face appointment, because of social distancing, we've had to put measures in to make sure that patients are screened prior to coming in. So there is delays, obviously, because of those measures. So it's something that we very much are trying to maintain the best we can with, near me telephone appointments. But as Rafe said, it's it's balancing the risk of just. We were in level 2 until last week, and we're now in level 1, and making sure that we're actually doing right by the public and the borders, and we are making the right decisions about the COVID prevalence in the community, and ensuring that if they do need a face-to-face appointment, that it's actually it's alongside the guidance that's come from Scottish Government, and we're maintaining the safety of the residents coming into the hospital.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think I'll combine my final question, the two questions together, if I may, just for brevity here. I just wanted an explanation around the rationale for reducing the HP services to such an extent. Why minor injury services are not operating at all. I think most importantly for me is why CAM services are running at a much reduced capacity, because we know that mental health is going to become such an issue through COVID and post-COVID.
Rafe Roberts.
Thank you. I mean, there's a number of issues in there, and I suppose some of them are linked to specific issues within particular services. So if I take the CAMS service as an example, I think it's fair to say that we were particularly challenged with our CAM service through 2019. We recognised that. We did a number of pieces of work to try and address some of the challenges in the service, which included recruiting additional staff into service, and you saw our performance last year go from a position that none of us were comfortable with to, by the early parts of this year, since one is obviously initially the COVID.
Yep. Thanks. I'm afraid our connection with Mr. Roberts is not going well. I wonder if Karen Hamilton would like to comment on the overall position in terms of these services which have been reduced or not operational. Karen Hamilton.
Yes, thank you, Convener. First of all, sincere apologies for the chaos we've had trying to make contact with you. Sincere apologies for that. Unfortunately, because I've been chasing around trying to make connection, I haven't been able to follow the conversation that's been ongoing so far. But I suppose as chair, just a couple of words in relation to my focus over the COVID pandemic has really, as you would expect, been to support the organisation and enable the non-executive director cohort to maintain their connections and their links with the organisation in terms of governance and scrutiny of the way we've been performing. We managed to maintain all our governance committees, but two minor issues around public governance, staff governance, but other governance issues were maintained over the pandemic, and it's still ongoing. I think that has helped from a chair's perspective to keep that overview and that sort of helicopter view of how the organisation is performing, whilst at the same time making sure that the things like the workforce support and so on was ongoing, which I know we've talked about, and to manage the public expectations to a certain extent as well, because clearly communication with the public through the whole process and now in relation to changes in levels and so on is absolutely crucial. I hope that's helpful, Convener, in relation to the conversations that have been going on this morning through our presentations.
Thank you very much. And perhaps Nikki Berry would like to add something also.
Yeah, sorry, I was removed. From a CAMS perspective, we're certainly not delivering on the CAMS standard, and that's something that we as a board are focusing on. We're working with Scottish Government, and there is enhanced support around CAMS and psychological therapy. What I would like to say is we previously have delivered on the CAMS standard. However, the issues that we have is that it's a small board, it's a small service, so from a sickness absence, from a vacancy perspective, that brings many challenges and impacts on the CAMS standards. But again, as I said, we are working with Scottish Government on how we can improve the standard, and that's something that I'm involved with, along with the leads for mental health and psychological therapy as well. COVID pandemic has brought an increase in referrals into mental health, and we just need to manage the impact on that and ensure that we can put processes in place to deliver the standard, but have a sustainable service. Being a small board isn't an excuse. What we need to do is we need to make sure that whatever happens, we have sustainable services going forward, and hopefully learning from other boards across Scotland, which is certainly what we're looking forward to doing.
Thank you very much. In the annual review report, the board suggested that 120 whole-time equivalent staff would be required to deliver services connected with the response to the pandemic. I wonder if I can ask whether all of those extra staff were secured and that service was therefore delivered. Nikki Berry?
Yeah, so just to give some perspective, the over 100 staff were, there were corporate services, they were in nursing, they were for flu vaccinations. So we are in the midst of recruitment. I can't say exactly where we are regarding the number and how many we've recruited, but we would be able to give you that information at a later date. But we certainly are in the midst of recruitment. From a nursing perspective, it's quite challenging to recruit registered nurses, and I spoke to the committee last year about how we need to be innovative regarding registered nurses, and that's across any discipline, and those are things that we are looking at, and you know, the whole of Scotland is looking at this, but certainly the 126 was across many services, wasn't just regarding nursing, and we can come back with with how we've progressed the recruitment into those posts.
That would be very helpful. And can I ask whether you've been able to put in place well-being support for your permanent staff, but also for anyone who's been brought in to assist in these current circumstances? Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, we have. So we have Here For You. We have a Here For You service, which is run by our head of psychology and our Rock Health department. We also, so yes, we have been delivering wellbeing for any staff that's coming in, and that can be staff. We've had approximately 20 retired staff come back into the board to help support with the flu vaccinations. So the support is there, and we've made sure it's on the intranet so that staff know the signposting's there, so staff are aware of where they can go for support.
Thank you very much. And can I call on Sandra White?
And good morning, everyone, and sorry about all the glitches that we've been having. I wanted to ask some questions on the interaction the board has with GPs and COVID assessment centres. We know that GPs are being paid to action these assets, as we may say in the health committee in that respect. Now, I just wondered if I could ask you a couple of questions in regard to practice capacity issues since March, how you've interacted with GP practices. Has extra costs been incurred by practices? And what additional payments, as I'd mentioned earlier, GPs do get paid for this. What additional payments have been paid to practices, and what purposes? And have there been referrals into secondary care, which was mentioned earlier, for example, mental health assessments, chronic conditions, looking into these types of things? So it's three separate questions, but I'll roll it all into the one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder if Andrew Bode might want to comment on the financial aspect. This, Andrew Bode.
So, I suppose just firstly, in terms of the financial context with primary care, and obviously primary care suffered significant disruption during the COVID period, and the facilities and access for services as a result of social distancing, infection control measures, etc., meant that practices have not always operated at the level that we would have expected pre-COVID, obviously. I'm sure colleagues will speak more on that. In terms of immediate payments to GPs, the first element that's been arranged and on a national basis has been provider sustainability. So essentially making sure that existing contract payments are paid irrespective of whether or not there were particular elements of the contract that weren't able to be delivered in line with the original expectations. So there's been sustainability payments which just really provide that kind of floor for practices to make sure that they've got that level of cash flow. Secondly, on top of that, Scottish Government obviously have made a couple of announcements in terms of additional funding support to practices specific to COVID. So there have been payments, particularly for some of the additional response that's been required in relation to infection control measures and support around PPE and things like that. In terms of the board's own response financially to this, it's probably been mainly about trying to work with practices to get our service able to be delivered safely. So we've worked through our primary care and community service management team to liaise directly with the practices and try and identify measures that can be taken to improve accommodation, to make it safer for treatment rooms and so on. And we have put in additional investment around that. It's not in the order of our overall resourcing of this, it's not particularly material. It's a few £100,000 of additional expenditure, and it's largely constrained by the ability to make those facilities safe. So there's certain activities that we just simply wouldn't be able to do. You can't redesign a building in 6 months or whatever, but what you can do is you can make changes to the treatment rooms to make them safer, change the cleaning regimes, etc., and try and put that support, that wraparound support in terms of the environment that's available to practices to operate within. I think Nikki could probably speak better than I could on the clinical services and how that's been supported. It's probably also worth saying that throughout the pandemic, one of the things that we have been committed to, and we've worked with practices throughout, really has been to try and make sure that the primary care investment plan that was agreed has continued to progress in line with the contract, and that's remained broadly on course throughout, basically. So we're on target to have recurring investments of just over £3 million through that programme, and that was, that's part of the main contract, but it's obviously had its own challenges in terms of implementation during this, but we've been committed as a board to trying to make sure that that progresses.
Rafe Roberts.
Thank you, Convener. I suppose I want to just come back in on and pick up on that point Andrew was just making about the work we've done with primary care to continue to build sustainability, and that work has continued, and we've engaged regularly with our GP leaders on that. And that specifically led, in one example, to us agreeing a new mental health service that will be rolled out, started in October, November, and will continue to expand through the winter until it is in full capacity early in 2021. And that is in response to building capacity to support GPs with the number of patients that they have coming in with mental health or distress issues, and that's certainly something that our primary care colleagues have really welcomed and has addressed one of their key priorities associated with the implementation of the primary care improvement plan.
Thank you, Convener. If I could just come back on one of the answers to that question before I move over to the community assessment centres. So basically, to clarify, there's been no extra costs incurred by practices. They have been reimbursed, and basically no additional payments have been made to practices. Is that correct?
Andrew Bourne.
Apart from the Scottish Government's monies.
Yeah, so I would say, well, bearing in mind that the Scottish Government are the primary source of financing for the GP contract, basically. So I think practices have received additional payments, largely in respect of offsetting their additional costs and their expenditures. We've tried to work with them to wrap support around them as much as possible, but it's not been really something that the board has introduced in terms of additional payments. What we have done, though, is we've made sure that we've honoured that same provider sustainability agreement. So we've tried to make sure that all of the local contracts, we continue to maintain cash. The contract's actually fully in place at this point. Just recognising the level of challenge that primary care has. So it's not been a matter of direct investment in primary care to expand practice capacity, because actually the opportunities to do that are limited. It's been about trying to give them as much stability as possible and trying to make sure that the support the board can provide in a wider context is there available to them.
Okay, thank you. So if I get this correct, GPs have had extra monies from the Scottish Government, as you mentioned before, and basically the contract you have with GPs has been honoured monetary-wise as well, even though they haven't been able to continue with what they would normally do. And you mentioned £100,000 additional monies. Is that additional monies to GP practices? Is that where that £100,000 is from?
Sorry, £100,000 probably a little bit more specific. It's additional costs incurred by the board to make facilities as fit for purpose as we can do so to adapt the environment to support through cleaning stuff. It's not direct payment to practices. It's about enabling the environment in practices to be as safe as possible. And it's really about what we can do practically in these circumstances to help them operate within their facilities. So that's probably covers that, I think.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Could I go? Thank you, Chair. Could I go on to basically the COVID assessment centres in regards to a couple of questions on that one? Could you tell us how you've organised the assessment centres in the borders and about the arrangements made with local GP practices during the pandemic and staffing it? I know you've mentioned staffing previously. And also, could you perhaps describe or explain how the CACs have been operating alongside out-of-hours services? And last question, what support has the board made to GP practices to supplement that provided by government guidance, which you did mention, I think, in your earlier statement?
Rafe Roberts.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we created a COVID assessment centre right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. We have located that within the Borders General Hospital in what had previously been an outpatient day hospital area. That is co-located with our out-of-hours service that we also moved, which had previously been immediately adjacent to the emergency department, and we moved that along with the COVID assessment centre so that they were co-located, and that also gave us a bit of additional capacity and space within the emergency department to help make that COVID secure. That service has therefore run alongside the out-of-hours service and the COVID assessment hub, staffed through a range of staff, AMPs, GPs, etc., with some support at various times from secondary care throughout the COVID pandemic. In addition to that, we are obviously involved in the current discussions to create a redesign of our unscheduled care service. And that service is also being run out of the same location. I think that picks up the initial comments. I don't know if Nikki wants to come in with any more detail.
Nikki Berry, briefly.
The only thing I would add, I think you asked about the engagement, and I think just to say that as Andrew said, the primary care management team as part of the governance and decision making, the Gold Command, that's where any decision making regarding the COVID hub and assessment has come up through there with the clinicians involved in Gold Command, and ensuring that obviously from a GP perspective and the lead for the COVID hub, they've had that link through to any decision making which the Chief Exec chairs.
Okay, thank you very much. I call David Stewart. David Stewart.
Rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. Could you describe the arrangements that you have for your health board area?
For COVID vaccination. Rafe Roberts.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is obviously going to be one of our key priorities over the next few months. I'll hand over in just a very second to Nikki, who's sort of leading that work for us. I think that the only sort of general point I would make is that we recognise this is a really important priority. We're absolutely focused on delivering it as quickly as possible, but we need to do that safely. And we need to recognise that we are planning for this with a significant level of uncertainty, particularly in terms of vaccine supply. I've been really pleased and impressed with the way in which staff have responded to this, but we are adapting on an almost daily basis as more information becomes available, as members of the committee will understand. It's probably early days yet, but we are absolutely focused at the moment on delivering the first phase of the vaccination programme, focused on our staff and care homes and social care staff. But maybe I'll hand over to Nikki for more of the detail.
Nikki Berry.
As the executive lead for the COVID vaccination, just agree with Rafe. This is, one of the things we're committed to delivering, but it is challenging. We're the lead agency, but have a governance structure that we are, which is SBC and NHS Borders, have a governance structure between us to ensure the successful delivery of this programme. Wave 1. We expect to receive 11,700 vaccines in Wave 1, and that obviously is to, that's the 2 doses. Wave 2 and Wave 3 logistically will be huge, and that's why it's critical that we work alongside Scottish Borders Council to ensure that we can deliver this programme. I would just like to say that from a flu vaccination, we've delivered an extremely successful flu vaccination programme where we've actually delivered the vaccination to over 45,000. Our numbers were just over 60,000, so we've delivered that to over 45,000, and I think that's testament to the staff.
David Stewart.
I think Nikki Berry makes a good point about comparing the rollout of flu vaccination with COVID-19 vaccination. Could I raise just a technical point? Perhaps you could put some flesh on the bones of this. Obviously, our understanding is that temperature control is vital. I think it's minus 70 degrees Celsius in terms of the current current vaccine that's available. Do you have facilities within Borders for the storage at the correct temperature for the vaccine?
Rafe Roberts.
Yeah, we have an ability within the Borders General Hospital. That's the point at which we do cold storage within the pharmacy at the Borders General Hospital. So as we get deliveries of the Pfizer vaccine, that comes into the Borders General Hospital and is then stored there at the correct temperature. The logistical issues we've then got is managing the transfer of that vaccine out to the wider Borders area, which we can do at sort of fridge temperature, if I can use that as a description, but you've then got a fixed window in which you can do that, and there are some quite detailed requirements in terms of moving that vaccine in its powdered form, and then only being able to constitute it and dilute it for actual vaccination on site when you get to the point at which you're actually delivering the vaccination. So there's some practical issues around that in terms of getting that into every single care home and back out and out into individual communities. That will also be particularly an issue when we deal with the housebound population. But yes, in terms of your specific question, we have capacity within the Borders General Hospital to store it at that temperature, and then we have to manage the logistics out across the borders.
David.
Yeah, Convener, could I also ask a question that has been raised at national level? That is that there is some question marks around the security of the vaccine. Without obviously breaching confidentiality, have you had discussions with the local police or indeed security services about this? Because this will certainly be an issue that affects boards throughout Scotland.
Rafe Roberts.
Yes, I can confirm. I had a conversation with one of the police commanders only the back end of last week on exactly that issue.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. And can I call on David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. And my questions around the vaccination programme. How does the board coordinate and report on who has been vaccinated and by whom?
Rafe Roberts.
So I suppose there's a mixture of approaches to that. At the moment, in terms of the COVID vaccination, there is an app that is available that records the information as the vaccination is given. That is available for all of the vaccinators to enter the information as the vaccination is given. The information that is then collected within that app then transfers into the GP record, so that we've then got an ongoing record of the vaccination, which vaccine they've had, when they had it, and that will obviously be difficult because we have to make sure we call people back for the second dose within the appropriate timescale.
David Torrance.
And my final question, Convener, what local mechanisms and procedures are in place to monitor and deal with any adverse reaction to vaccination, given it has been tested on a healthy trial population and not those with underlying conditions?
Rafe Roberts.
Yeah, I saw that it looked like Nikki had lost the connection, so I'm not sure if she's come back in. I mean, in terms of the arrangements for that, we are complying with all of the guidance around that. Individuals are required to wait for 15 minutes after they've received their vaccination to make sure that they haven't had an immediate negative reaction. We are doing the vaccination in places where we've got the appropriate kit to deal with any issues. The staff who are doing the vaccinations have been given training around the specific aspects related to this vaccination. And as committee members are probably aware, on the back of the initial couple of incidents that occurred in England on the back of the vaccination early on, I think on the first day, a decision was made at that point that in terms of continuing the vaccination programme using that vaccine, that any individual with a known allergy would not be vaccinated at this point. So that's part of the consent and discussion that we would have with individuals before we gave the vaccination. So there's a range of control measures in place to do that. And there is also an alert mechanism available for staff, so that if they experience or see any negative reaction from anybody, that's then fed into the national alert system, and then that is exactly what happened in that instance, and that information can then be transmitted across the country so that people can understand what instances happen.
Thank you very much. And finally, Nikki Berry.
Rafe's answered the question beautifully, to be honest. Just to let you know, though, every board has an immunisation coordinator, and they manage the adverse event. So if there is any adverse events, these are escalated and there's a process. Really nothing else to add. Rafe's said everything I would have said.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you to all of our witnesses from NHS Borders today. Apologies from our end for any of the technical issues that we've all faced in this session. I know that a number of witnesses wish to add additional points which were not added live, so to speak, but please feel free to write to us with any points that you wish to make during the course of the question session that you weren't able to address. And likewise, we may write to you with one or two areas where we haven't fully explored the situation. But thanks to all concerned for your patience. Thank you to the colleagues from NHS Borders for your attendance. And we will now move on to the final item on our public agenda, which is again consideration of subordinate legislation, this being the negative instrument we considered earlier this morning and sifted, and this is the Food and Feed EU Exit Amendment Regulations 2020, which we first considered on the 24th of November. We got clarification from the Scottish Government on the matters raised, and this is our opportunity to consider this instrument. Does any member have any issues they wish to make in relation to this instrument now that we've had a response from the Scottish Government? If not, then can I ask if the committee is agreed to make no recommendation on this instrument? Are we all agreed? That is agreed. Thank you very much. And that concludes the committee's consideration of this instrument. We will now move into private session. I suspend this meeting and we will resume in 5 minutes' time on a different platform. I now suspend this meeting.